A house for the price of a used iPhone, no roommates, no gimmicks, a real deed with your name on it. Not a trailer, not a shed, but an actual house. It sounds fake, and honestly, it should, but it isn't. There are places in the United States, real places with streets and neighbors and mailing addresses, where homes are so cheap they feel like a mistake, like someone forgot a zero, or maybe like you weren't supposed to be looking there at all. And that raises a much bigger question. If housing is impossible in most of America, why is it basically free in others? Is it danger? Is it decay? Is it opportunity hiding in plain sight? Or is cheap housing just the receipt for something you don't notice until it's too late? I went looking for answers, and what I found wasn't a list of hidden gems. It was a map of trade-offs. And every cheap town on that map asks the same uncomfortable question. What are you willing to live with in order to live cheaply? Let's start at the bottom. Number 9, Pine Bluff, Arkansas. You can buy a house in Pine Bluff for less than a year of rent in most U.S. cities. And on the surface, that sounds like a win. So why don't people line up? Pine Bluff sits in southeast Arkansas along the Arkansas River. And on paper, it has everything a cheap housing success story should have. Space, history, infrastructure, and prices that feel like a typo. Median home prices in some neighborhoods hover under $60,000. And in certain listings, you'll see full houses for $40,000 or less. Not shells, not half-burned structures, actual homes. So here's the obvious question. If it's that cheap, what went wrong? The short answer is simple. Jobs left, and they didn't come back. Pine Bluff used to be a manufacturing and agricultural hub. When those industries declined, the population followed. What stayed behind were houses, lots of them, and fewer people to fill them. Vacancy climbed, tax bases shrank, services struggled, and crime rates rose, especially violent crime, which is usually the first statistic people bring up. And yes, crime here is higher than the national average. But here's the part that rarely gets explained. Crime in Pine Bluff is concentrated, block by block, street by street. That means one neighborhood can feel abandoned and tense, while another feels quiet, even boring. So why doesn't cheap housing automatically fix that? Because houses don't create opportunity. People do. A Reddit user once wrote, "Pine Bluff isn't scary everywhere. It's just tired. The city feels like it's waiting for someone to decide it's worth caring about again. And that's the real cost here. Not money, but momentum. If you moved here, you could own your home outright, but what happens next? Where do you work? Who do you build community with? What do you do when something breaks and there's no contractor available for weeks?" Cheap housing solves one problem and quietly creates 10 others. And if Pine Bluff feels heavy, wait until you see what happens when cheap housing meets water. Number 8, Cairo, Illinois. Cairo looks like a geography trivia question. It sits at the southern tip of Illinois, right where the Mississippi and Ohio rivers collide. Two massive rivers. Prime trade location. Incredible strategic value. So why does it feel forgotten? At its peak, Cairo had over 15,000 residents. Today, it has fewer than 2,000. And the houses reflect that. You can find them for $20,000, $15,000, sometimes even less. So again, why so cheap? Because Cairo didn't just lose jobs. It lost people, and then it lost time. Floods hit repeatedly. Businesses closed. Racial and economic divisions hardened. Investment stopped. And once enough people leave a town, something strange happens. It becomes expensive to be poor there. Utilities cost more per person. Roads don't get fixed. Hospitals struggle. Schools consolidate or disappear. So, even though the house is cheap, life gets complicated. There's also the floodplain reality. Cairo is surrounded by levees, and while they've held so far, the risk is always there. Insurance isn't always simple. Financing can be a headache. Some lenders won't touch it at all. And yet, people still stay. Why? Because the river is beautiful. Because the cost of entry is low. Because when a place empties out, the people who remain tend to know each other. One former resident said, "Cairo feels like the end of the road. But sometimes the end of the road is quiet in a way cities forgot how to be." That's the trade. You can buy a house here outright, but you're also buying into a shrinking system. So the real question becomes this: are you escaping the housing crisis, or are you stepping into a different one? And if Cairo feels isolated, let's move somewhere bigger. Somewhere where cheap housing hides in plain sight. Number 7, South Bend, Indiana. South Bend is not a ghost town. It isn't abandoned. It isn't even small. And yet, you can still find houses here under $80,000, which immediately raises suspicion. South Bend is home to Notre Dame. It has hospitals, universities, and jobs. So why hasn't the housing market exploded like it has everywhere else? The answer is uneven demand. South Bend is a tale of two cities. Near the university and medical centers, prices climb fast. Investors compete. Renovations happen. Coffee shops appear. But just a few miles away, you'll find neighborhoods where demand never recovered after manufacturing declined. Streets where homes outnumber buyers. Blocks where prices stayed low because perception never changed. This is where cheap housing hides best. Not in the middle of nowhere, but right next to prosperity. Median prices in some areas sit between $70,000 and $90,000. Rent remains relatively low. Cost of living stays below the national average. So what's the catch? It's risk. And it's timing. If you buy in the wrong pocket, appreciation may never come. If you buy in the right pocket, you might get priced out before you even realize the change is happening. One local explained it perfectly, saying, "South Bend rewards people who understand maps. Not just Google Maps. Who's moving where? Which streets are changing? Which ones are frozen in time?" Cheap housing here isn't about danger. It's about betting on momentum, and momentum is hard to see until it's already gone. So ask yourself this: would you rather buy cheap in a place that's already fallen, or buy cheap in a place that might be about to move without you? Because the next place answers that question in a very different way. Up to now, cheap housing has looked like decline, distance, or bad timing. But what happens when housing is cheap on purpose? When a place isn't forgotten but quietly avoided? This is where the story gets stranger. Because here, cheap housing isn't just about what's missing. It's about what's nearby, what's looming, or what people would rather not think about. Number 6, McDowell County, West Virginia. This isn't one town, it's an entire county, and it might be the cheapest place to buy a house in America. In McDowell County, you can still find homes for $25,000, sometimes less, full houses with porches, yards, and empty streets around them. On the surface, it feels unreal. But the reason prices are so low is simple. Coal built this place, and coal left it behind. In 1950, nearly 100,000 people lived here. Today, fewer than 20,000 remain. That's not a slowdown, that's an evacuation. When coal collapsed, nothing replaced it. And when the jobs disappeared, the population followed. Schools closed or consolidated, hospitals became farther apart, and entire communities slowly thinned out. But life didn't stop. People still garden, churches still meet, neighbors still watch out for each other, and that creates a strange contradiction. Because the town feels alive even as the numbers say it shouldn't be. A local once said, "You don't move here to get ahead, you move here to slow down." And slowing down can feel like freedom until you realize what it costs. Internet access can be unreliable, healthcare often requires long drives, and career mobility is limited unless you already work remotely. So the real question isn't whether you can afford a house here, it's whether owning a house matters if opportunity feels capped. If you owned your home outright but had to give up momentum, would that feel like independence? Or would it feel like a ceiling you can't break through? And if McDowell County feels isolated, wait until cheap housing collides with the edge of the country. Number 5, Calexico, California. California and cheap housing rarely belong in the same sentence, and yet Calexico exists. This city sits directly on the U.S.-Mexico border. Across from Mexicali, surrounded by desert, border crossings, agriculture, and international trade. And by California standards, its home prices are shockingly low. Median prices hover around $300,000, which sounds expensive until you remember where you are, because in much of California that barely buys a parking spot. So why is Calexico cheaper than almost everywhere else in the state? Geography cuts both ways. Calexico is hot, extremely hot, with summer temperatures that regularly push past 110 degrees, the kind of heat that makes daily life feel heavier. Jobs exist in logistics, border trade, and agriculture, but they don't pay tech salaries. Many residents commute across the border every day, adding complexity to life that most Americans never experience. There's also perception. Border towns carry stigma, politics, and headlines, and perception keeps demand down even when reality is more nuanced. One resident explained it this way: "It's not cheap because it's bad. It's cheap because it's invisible. And that's what makes Calexico interesting. It's one of the few places in California where working-class families can still buy, not speculate, not flip, but actually own. So the question becomes whether you'd trade perfect weather and prestige for ownership, whether you'd live somewhere that doesn't impress anyone but lets you stop renting, because cheap housing doesn't always mean broken. Sometimes it just means overlooked. But overlooked doesn't always mean safe. Number 4. New Madrid, Missouri. New Madrid looks quiet, almost too quiet. It sits along the Mississippi River, surrounded by farmland and old buildings that feel like they've seen better centuries. You can buy houses here for $60,000 to $80,000, sometimes less, which would be unremarkable if it weren't for what sits underneath it. New Madrid lies on top of one of the most dangerous fault lines in North America, the New Madrid Seismic Zone. In 1811 and 1812, a series of massive earthquakes hit this area, so powerful they rang church bells on the East Coast and temporarily reversed the flow of the Mississippi River. Geologists agree another major quake will happen. They just don't know when. That uncertainty hangs over the housing market. Insurance can be tricky. Financing sometimes costs more. Buyers hesitate, and hesitation keeps prices low. But people still live here. They farm, raise families, and go to work like nothing is wrong. Because waiting for disaster is no way to live. One local summed it up bluntly: if you lived your life waiting for disasters, you'd never live anywhere. And that's the tension at the heart of New Madrid. The town isn't falling apart. It's waiting. Cheap housing here comes with a philosophical question more than a financial one. Do you avoid risk at all costs? Or do you accept it as part of the deal, knowing that every place has risk, and some places just admit it? At this point, a pattern should be forming. Cheap housing isn't random. It's the shadow cast by something else. Lost jobs, lost people, lost attention, or looming uncertainty. And the closer you get to the bottom of the list, the heavier those shadows become. Because the final places don't just ask where you would live. They ask what you would give up to live cheaply. Up to now, every place on this list has asked you to give something up. A job market, convenience, prestige, certainty. But the last 3 don't just ask what you're willing to sacrifice. They ask something deeper. They ask why you want cheap housing in the first place. Because motivation matters more than money. And cheap housing reveals who's running towards something and who's running away. Number 3, Gary, Indiana. Everyone knows the name, and that's the problem. Gary became shorthand for decline, crime, abandonment, a place people reference without ever visiting. You can buy houses here for $40,000, sometimes $20,000, entire blocks where empty homes outnumber occupied ones. So, let's ask the obvious question. If housing is this cheap, why isn't everyone moving in? Because Gary didn't just lose jobs, it lost trust. Steel left, people followed, the tax base collapsed, and infrastructure followed right after. But here's what never makes the headlines. Gary is right next to Chicago, less than an hour away. That proximity should have saved it, but it didn't. Because cheap housing doesn't matter if people don't feel safe investing their lives there. Some neighborhoods are stabilizing, others are hollowed out. Gary isn't one story, it's a patchwork. And buying here means choosing a side of that patchwork carefully. One resident said something that stuck with me. Gary isn't dead, it's just uneven. And that's the risk. Buy in the wrong pocket and your house gets cheaper every year. Buy in the right pocket and you're early. So here's the real question. Would you gamble on a comeback? Or would you rather pay more somewhere else to avoid regret? Because Gary proves something uncomfortable. Cheap housing isn't always about affordability. Sometimes it's about confidence. And confidence is one of the hardest things for a city to rebuild. Number 2, Pine Ridge, South Dakota. This is not a place people talk about when they talk about real estate, which might be exactly why homes here can cost less than a used car. Pine Ridge sits within the Pine Ridge Reservation, one of the poorest areas in the United States. Unemployment is high, life expectancy is low, opportunity is limited, and yet families live here, culture thrives here, and history is alive here in a way spreadsheets don't capture. So why is housing so cheap? Because markets don't value resilience, they value profit. Outside investment is minimal. Economic pipelines are thin. Structural barriers slow growth, not because people don't care, but because systems weren't built to help them win. This isn't decline, this is neglect. And neglect creates a different kind of discomfort. If you move somewhere cheap because others were pushed there, what does that say about you? One local put it bluntly, "People want cheap houses. They don't want our problems." That sentence lands hard because it forces an uncomfortable question. Is cheap housing still appealing when it comes with responsibility? Pine Ridge isn't a hidden gem. It's a mirror, and not everyone likes what it reflects back at them. Number 1, Cairo, Illinois. Cairo feels like the end of something, because in many ways it is. This town sits at the confluence of the Mississippi and Ohio rivers. Once booming, once strategic, once alive. Now you can buy houses here for $15,000, sometimes less, but you might be the only person on the block. At its peak, Cairo had over 15,000 residents. Today, fewer than 2,000 remain. Entire neighborhoods are empty. Downtown feels frozen in time, like the clock stopped and nobody came back to restart it. So why hasn't Cairo rebounded? Flood risk, lost rail importance, a history of racial tension, economic isolation, everything hit at once. And once momentum reverses this hard, restarting it becomes almost impossible. One former resident said it best, Cairo didn't slowly die, it bled out. And that's the final form of cheap housing. Not risky, not overlooked, not misunderstood, just exhausted. So here's the final question, the one this entire video has been circling from the start. If a house costs almost nothing, but costs a town everything, is it still a bargain? The truth about cheap housing in America is that it isn't a hack. It's a signal. It tells you where jobs left, where people aged, where investment stopped, and where the future feels uncertain. Sometimes cheap means opportunity. Sometimes it means warning. And the difference isn't the price. It's why the price fell. So before you ask, where can I buy a house for nothing? Ask something harder. What kind of life does that price buy me? Because in America, housing is never just about shelter. It's about belief. So now I want to hear from you. Which of these towns would you actually live in if the house was free? Not invest in, not flip, live in. And which one would you never touch, no matter how cheap it got? Drop the town name in the comments and tell me why. I read every single one. And if you want more videos that expose the parts of America nobody wants to talk about, hit subscribe, because the cheapest places usually have the most expensive stories.